Welcome to the Sol Epoch, the sole place to catch up on Solana and Solana developments. And today we're going to be talking about a big one. This is a proposed development, a proposed change, and that's a change to the consensus mechanism. Essentially how Solana as a layer 1 decides how to make a block, and on how all those validators agree that that's a valid block. Now, I am talking about the Alpenglow upgrade. Now, Alpenglow, it's a complete rewrite of Solana's consensus layer, and it's been proposed by Anza. Anza is a Solana-focused software development firm, and they were actually spun out of Solana Labs. Solana Labs was part of the creation of Solana, so that's the relationship there. Now, when we're talking about consensus, things can get really technical and complicated, and I'm not a person for technical or complicated, so I'm gonna try and present this the way that I understand it and in a more simple terms than maybe a technical person would. What the proposal that's coming out of Anza is to swap out the current consensus mechanism, which is proof of history, but it's actually proof of history with a tower Byzantine fault tolerance mechanism. Exactly, we're not going to go there. But at the end of the day, they want to propose swapping out proof of history and introduce two different components. With the Alpenglow upgrade or the Alpenglow consensus mechanism, they're looking for is they're targeting instant finality. Essentially, they want to move from that 12-second finality that there currently is on Solana to around 100 to 150 milliseconds. That's around 100 times faster than what Solana is today. So the idea being that you bring in a more efficient consensus mechanism, you speed up the chain, and you get this real world app chain where you can basically just game in real time because you have this instant finality. The two technical changes that Alpenglow would bring to consensus would be voter and rotor. So voter is going to be an off-chain aggregation of votes. Essentially, they're going to take the voting portion of Solana and take that right off chain. And voting transactions make up a large amount of transactions on Solana. I believe 30 to 40%. It could be a little bit lower than that. It's essentially a lot of lag on the system that they're looking to remove and take it off chain. Essentially, just a single aggregation of the validation will hit the chain. So you take all the votes, you take them off chain, but when the votes are agreed upon, you get a single one that is recorded back to the chain, and you get a two-tier finalization, which is what also leads to some of this efficiency, which is the first path is they ask all the validators if they're there and ready to agree. If there's 80% of validators and they agree, you get basically that first path. Now, if there's a bit of a lag or there's not enough to meet that 80% threshold, the blockchain actually slows down, the consensus mechanism slows down, and you only need 60% of the stake when that passes then by the second proposal. And having all that speed is what is being chased by this Solana upgrade, and I don't know that this is necessarily going to be something everybody agrees on. I don't think the validators, at least the smaller validators, are going to like this change, but I do have some history to bring into this. I'm not saying this just out of left field. Anza, I believe, was also behind the change, or at least the proposed change to the inflation rate on Solana. I think Solana has like an 8% inflation rate currently, and that was something that they took off the Cosmos blockchain. It wasn't something that was maybe deeply thought out when they were developing Solana because they were doing it so fast. They kind of just grabbed Cosmos's model and thought this is something we'll solve later. Long story short, it actually did not meet the threshold and it didn't pass. And I know there was some disappointment in the community because they think that a lower inflation rate could be better. The whole reason I bring this inflation Solana improvement proposal that didn't quite pass, it was the smaller validators that I think were mostly concerned about reducing that inflation, reducing that value return you get for staking your Solana. And by reducing that, there was a reduction in profit and operating margin for these smaller validators. And I think we have a similar issue that's going to come up here with this proposed change. Now, as a non-technical person, I have to say all of these promises, they sound great. It sounds great to make Solana really fast and really cheap. But when you look at it from a staker's perspective or a validator's perspective, similar to the yield, here there might be some concerns to the operating margins and some of the costs that would be put onto validators by changing the consensus mechanism to Alpenglow. Specifically, I'm talking about higher hardware and bandwidth expenditures, and this mainly has to do with the speed by which you're gonna have to run as a validator. And this essentially comes down to how much information is being pushed out and how much bandwidth you're gonna need to be an effective validator. You're gonna have to spend more money on internet, on fiber, on infrastructure to stay fast. And that's something that maybe small validators won't be able to maintain, and it might push out smaller validators and thus centralize the validator pool set. Additional to those hardware and bandwidth requirements and the costs associated to that, there's also going to be an economic shakeup when it comes to those voting transactions. There are fees that are collected by validators from the current consensus mechanism. I think it's around 20-30%. The gross of every epoch, the rewards, come from the voting transactions. Alpenglow is going to remove that revenue stream. The new rotor relay reward has not really been, let's say, finalized or mentioned. So we know that the voting transactions, that 30% you might be making as a validator, is going to go away. There is going to be a new rotor relay reward, which is supposed to take over for it, but without really knowing what that's going to pay out, it's hard to estimate what profits or what the cost to operate the validator would be. This is where I bring out my simple man and simple brain, and the other thing is consensus it's a big deal. It's a big part of the blockchain, a big part of that stack. Proof of history is also kind of core to the unique way that Solana operates, what's allowed it to be so fast. And on the other hand, it's also given it a lot of nightmares and a lot of technical issues, including spam attacks and slowdowns. However, of recent, Solana seems to have been really stable. It's been able to handle some very large token releases, some very big volumes on the layer 1 with minimal hiccups, I would argue. And I don't think there's been any major outages now, I think, since 2023, or don't quote me on that. My one concern as a non-technical person, just with a simple brain, is do we really need to change it if it's working? And what kind of risks are we introducing to changing something like this? It is being beta tested. They are working through it from a technical perspective. So I don't think any of the validators, I don't think anyone's going to just agree to this. You're going to need to have a 67% consensus, change the consensus mechanism. You're going to have to agree to reach governance quorum to implement this change to the chain. It's a hard one to swallow. If things are going well, it does introduce a lot of risk. The beta testing and having this fully tested before implementing it will be really the core decision there. So if you're a Solana holder, if you're a staker, if you run a validator, you're in a position to vote. Now, the only other big consensus change mechanism I can think of is when Ethereum went from proof of work to proof of stake. That one went off really well from a technical perspective, but it didn't lead to necessarily the economic outcome that Ethereum holders had hoped. And I do know that there was a lot of unhappy miners. At the same time, it just changed the dynamics of Ethereum after they switched off proof of work. And I think it was successful from an efficiency perspective, as it did reduce a lot of its emissions and a lot of its costs related to mining it. So there was an efficiency there. It did change the dynamics of Ethereum. I think if you're going to change something as big as consensus on Solana, you should be weary or at least willing to accept that risk that is unaccounted for when things are working, when things are just kind of steady on. And let me know what you think in the comments below. Let me know if there's a preference, if you'd rather stay with the consensus mechanism, if you think some of these costs are going to push out the smaller validators. Well, leave those thoughts in the comments. And thanks for joining the Sol Epoch.